What's going on, guys? It's Jono, and today we're going to be talking about errors and error handling in make.com. So what are they? Why do they happen? And how can we solve it? So if that's something you're interested in, let's dive in. So effectively, there's four main reasons why your scenarios could be breaking, right? So first one is data mapping. Data or data, I'm not too sure, one of the two, but data mapping. So what happens here is that you may have a module that has to have a required field, but it's missing critical information in that required field. And as a result, it's breaking, right? So let's go ahead and show a practical example of what this looks like. So in make.com, I'm actually going to create a scenario just to effectively break it for you guys here. But we're going to use Google Sheets just as a simple module here. And we're going to search for a particular row. Okay. And let's say that in this sheet here, I'm just going to select the correct account here. Let's say that I also need this ID just to kind of match this up. Perfect. Okay, awesome. And we're going to select from all and type in the spreadsheet ID here. Okay, I lost my train of thought there for a second here, but let's say that we want to break this scenario. We would need to filter, right, based on first name. And let's just say, for example, that, we leave this blank, right? And then we run it. It's going to return something to us, right? But now let's say that we want to update that exact row, right, that we just tried to search for. So we'll type in update a row, and we're going to go into select all. Once again, we're going to copy this ID in so that we can update this spreadsheet row here. It's not going to let us update a row that doesn't exist. So it's going to create an error, right? And we need to solve this error. So the row is going to be this row number here, and we're just going to put test as the first name, click OK, we'll run this scenario, and we received this error, right? So missing value of a required parameter row number. So one of the most common errors is going to be that we simply just don't have the field that we actually need to complete the operation. The second thing is something called API rate limiting. So let's say in this exact example again, right? Maybe you want to update like 700 rows at the same time, right? Maybe you do a bulk update of everyone in your CM. Maybe there's like 40,000 people, right? And you're trying to update everyone. You push into this, what's going to happen is Google is going to be like, whoa, slow down. Like, we're not going to give you access to 40,000 requests in 30 seconds. That's just not possible. So once you hit the ceiling, which might be like 100 requests per every 5 minutes or hour or whatever, we're going to cut you off, right? And then after a certain amount of time, we'll give you access again, and you can update it, but you can't update 40,000 records at the same time, because if they allowed that to happen, then their whole servers would crash because everyone would be doing this, and it just wouldn't be feasible for them as a business, right? So there is rate limiting with pretty much every major app that you're going to be using, and that could be another cause here as well. And then apps, sometimes they just become unavailable, right? So some applications, they might have downtime, they might be undergoing maintenance, right? Or maybe they just have an internal server error on their part and their site is just completely down, right? And you can't access it and there's nothing you can do. And if that's the result, well, then you're not going to be able to use it in your automated workflows, right? And the last thing is authorization. So with a lot of these applications, right, you'll have probably, dozens of connections in make.com to all these different applications you're using. But a lot of these authentication or these authorizations, they will expire in a certain amount of time. That could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be whatever amount of time, but they'll eventually expire. And when they do, you're not going to be able to access them anymore. So there are four main reasons, right, that you're going to run into errors here. And we need to solve for all of these, right? So effectively, their errors are categorized into two different sections here. So you have critical errors and then you have warnings, right? So critical errors are really what you want to pay attention to, because that's going to shut down your app, shut down your workflow, and it's just going to stop running, right? And then there's warnings, which are not critical, right? But for example, maybe you run out of storage, right? So for example, maybe you have an error handler set up and it's storing the executions, and then all of a sudden it runs out of storage. That's a warning, right? It's not going to shut down your whole workflow, but it will come up as a warning, right? So the major ones that you want to be watching out for are critical errors, but both are important. And what we need to do is we need to debug these particular errors. Now, before we kind of dive into debugging, there's a ton of different errors that you can have, right? And beyond errors, there's just a lot of messages that you can get. So if you think about an error, it's just part of the HTTP response status code, and you can see them all kind of broken down here. So if you have something between 100 to 199, it's just an informational response. So all Make is doing is it's sending requests from make.com to another application. That other application, it could be, for example, Google Sheets, right? And then it's retrieving information from Google Sheets, and it's finding the row in this case, and then it's updating the row, and it's sending information to update, and then it's getting the information back saying, hey, we successfully updated it, right? So in doing so, you're getting all different types of responses. If it's good, you might get some informational responses, and it's also going to say, hey, the status is successful, right? So we received your request, everything went according to plan, good job. 200 to 299 is what you want to see. But when it comes to status codes 300 to 399, it means that there's a redirect message, right? So the resource that you're trying to find, whether it's an application or whether it's a website or whatever, it's been moved to another place, right? In some of these instances, you're not going to be able to find it. In other instances, it's going to redirect you to another place that you have to find it there. And really the major errors that you're going to be running into, like if we kind of come back here and take a look at this, this would be likely a status 400 error, right? So effectively, there's a client error response. So what happens a lot of the time is that, well, we can actually just click on this and we can take a look, but a bad request, the server cannot or not process the request to do something that is perceived to be a client error. So maybe you give it the wrong information. Maybe you don't give it any information at all. Maybe you're not authorized to use it, right? So maybe that authentication with the application shut down after a certain amount of time, or so on and so forth. Maybe the resource is entirely not found. The application is offline, right? Maybe they're in maintenance, or maybe they had downtime on their server, all of that kind of stuff. So there's all of these different error codes, and that kind of just hopefully gives you a bit of insight as to what these status codes mean. They're not all bad. Some of them are good, like the status 200 code is good. And effectively, we need to solve these, right? So the first thing that we can do is we can come over to make.com and we can take a look and see, before we figure out how to solve them, I want to see how we can figure out if something's going wrong. So in your scenarios, I'm just going to go to inactive scenarios here, and you can take a look at this little warning icon here, which means that this particular workflow has been shut off and the scenario requires your attention. More details about the issue can be found in the log file. So how you go about solving something like this to get it back up and live is you click into the particular workflow, and you'd see, first of all, there's a lot of records in the queue that are waiting to be processed, right? And if we just looked at the history, for example, right, there's no data. So this has been shut off for a while, but let's just try and run this once, right? Let's just see what happens. We'll process old data. And this is actually going to give me another error, because I'm trying to process literally 2,154 records all at the same time, which is obviously going to cause some major issues with make.com, right? So it's just flat out, it's not going to work for their server. And this is actually going to cause an error. And we'll see that in 2 seconds here. So it's running 2,000 scenarios at the same time. And we're just going to wait to see what happens here. So you can see that it's just processing so many different records at the same time. But ultimately speaking, Google is not going to allow this to keep happening for 2,000 records, right? We're already down by like 150 or something like that from when we started. And we have hit a warning here. And here we go. So we've just logged into it and we can see there's a 429 error code, which is resource exhausted. If we kind of come back in here, we can see too many requests, right? So the user sent too many requests in a given amount of time. So we are getting rate limited right now by Google. So we can no longer send requests. Now, in this example, what the best thing to do here would be is if you're hitting a rate limiting and you have tons of extra requests that you still have to send out, what you'd want to do is do a couple things, right? So you'd create a module here, okay? And you would go into tools and you'd add sleep here. In this sleep section, you just delay it by, let's say, 20 seconds. So every consecutive run, it's going to have to wait 20 seconds, right? Which is going to increase the amount of time that it takes, which means that you're not going to hit the rate limit cap, because the rate limit cap is defined by a certain amount of executions in a limited amount of time. So if you're expanding the time horizon, you're going to take longer to execute all of those tasks, and you're not going to hit that finite limit in a short amount of time. So that is just one way to go about doing it. But when you're looking for records, what you want to do is go into the history tab and take a look at all of the records and see where it's saying there's an error, right? In this case, it's saying success in all of them because I have an error handler set up already for this. But what I'm going to do is find another scenario that has already received an error. And to make things simple, I'm just going to go back into this original module that we created, and we can go into history here and we can see that there's an error, right? Status. You can get the details of this run, come in and you can find out why, right? So in this case, it's going to tell you by hitting this cloud button here with this massive warning button, and you'll be able to understand what it is that caused this error to happen. And you'll be able to see, hey, you know, it's missing a field, and it's specifically missing the row number. So you know that in this particular instance, the reason why it's failing is because we don't have the row number from the previous step. This is empty, and this is a required field for this module to run. Which then brings me to the last point here is, how do you actually solve this, right? How do you actually overcome this so that you can effectively, you know, move past all of these errors? And that's where error handling comes in. And there's a couple ways we can do this, right? And we're going to go over every single one, but effectively speaking, there's really three that you'll probably use. And of the three, there's one that I use probably the vast majority of time, right? So when you click on this particular module here, right? And errors, you know, they're inevitable. They're going to happen at some point in time. But when you right click on it, you can go over error handling. And in the error handling, there is 5 different abilities that you have. You can break, commit, ignore, resume, and roll back. So let's go over these individually. Break is the most powerful, and this is the one you're going to probably use at least 90% of the time. At least for me, I use it 90% of the time. And what break does is if I click in on this, it's going to pause for 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, it's going to try and execute the module again. And then if on the second time, on the first attempt afterwards, it fails, then it's going to try a second time. And then if it fails on the second time, it's going to wait 15 minutes and then try a third time. And after three attempts, if it still fails, then it will stop, right? And it will stop the scenario. It'll turn it off. Okay. So that is break. This is the best, in my opinion. And the reason why it works well is because there's a lot of one-off errors that you're going to encounter. So for example, if there's downtime on an application, if there's rate limiting on an application, it's going to solve both of those because both of those are temporary errors, right? Which means that they're both going to be overcome just given enough time. So if you give some time and you run the scenario again, it'll work, right? And this makes up such a large amount of the errors you're actually going to be encountering on make.com. So that is why, in my opinion, break is the number one error handler to use. Now, the thing is if you go to save it, it's it's going to say, but this isn't going to be ready to use. And the reason it's not ready to use is because we need to hit this number 1 over here, which means there's one error before this can be set up. And it says this directive requires storing of incomplete executions to be enabled. So what that means, if that's gibberish to you, and it was gibberish to me the first time I read it, but what that means is like, by default, make doesn't store your scenarios, right? So if a scenario if it runs and it doesn't work and it breaks, it's not going to save it. So you have to turn on the ability for make to store and save those incomplete executions so you can run them at a later point in time. So all you have to do is hit this text, and you have to essentially just allow storing of incomplete executions, and then it's good to go, right? And there's a couple other features here, right? So you can have sequential processing, which means that it's not going to go on to the next. It's not going to go on to the next sequence until the first one is done, right? So it'll handle synchronously one workflow activation at a time. And then data is confidential. So if you don't want data to be logged, then you can turn it as confidential. And there's a bunch of other stuff here. To be honest, I just leave these all, like I don't touch any of this. The default settings are good enough for me. You can play around with it if you want to, but the only major one that's really important here is allowing the storing of incomplete executions. So you can turn that on and save it, and it's good to go. Now let's explore some other options here. If we just delete that and we go back to error handling, there is commit and rollback. Now, these two you're probably not going to use. Like for, I would say the vast majority of you out there, you're just never going to use this, and I never use this. The only reason these are beneficial is if you're using like a custom database like SQL or Postgres or MongoDB or whatever, and you're having that in your workflow. So if you have a workflow, you save stuff to the database, commit and rollback would be useful to you. The reason why is that if you have commit as the error handler, when it reaches that stage and it breaks, it's going to commit all the saved changes to the database. But if you have rollback, it's going to remove anything from the database that was saved in that particular workflow, right? So that is why it's beneficial. Commits your actions to commits the data to the database, and rollback will remove it if it has the power to do so in the workflow, right? But for most people that are using make.com, they're not using a database like Postgres or SQL or whatever, right? So it's not going to be super applicable. And if you're not using this, these are the exact same as an ignore error handler. And with an ignore error handler, essentially what this is doing is when it reaches this step, it just shuts off the workflow and it ignores it, right? It's not going to cause the workflow to break down. It's not going to cause the workflow to stop. It's just going to stop that particular execution of the workflow and then move on. And for other future executions, they can run normally, right? So this is good for non-critical tasks. I do this often when it comes to things like analytics, right? So if I don't have required data for analytics, right? Something may have gone wrong in the fray, then I'll probably throw an ignore on there if it's just something very minor. Of course, in a perfect world, you fix the errors so that they don't happen, of course. But when you have a million things and you're juggling a million different responsibilities, sometimes it's easy just to throw in an ignore, especially for something that's super low priority. So that is something that I use a bit, but usually it's break. Now let's just cover the last one here, which is resume. So with resume, what happens here is it's going to skip over this step and it's going to move on to the next step. And it's going to fill in the data that's missing with defaults. So for example, if I just put spreadsheet ID and I just copied these values here, just so we can get a clear picture of this. And we click OK, and we have another module here, and let's just set a variable just to make it super simple. We can just say test variable. What we could do is we could just have updated columns here. Actually, let's just do spreadsheet ID here. Okay, sweet. And this should come out as a value of spreadsheet ID. So even though this failed, you can see it triggered this resume workflow and it continued on to the next step here. And it filled in the test variable with spreadsheet ID, which we set as a default down here, right? So if you have a default value that you can put in, you just want to continue past it, then this is a great option. But a lot of the time with make.com, you're using custom variables. So this may not work, but a great use case for this is, let's say you have salespeople on your team, and let's say for whatever random chance there's a client that doesn't have a sales rep, you can just assign it as a default, like a fallback value of like your primary sales rep, and it just automatically gets assigned to that person if nobody else has been assigned to that person up until this point in time. So that's just like one example of how you could use Resume to handle error handling in make.com. Now, just kind of coming back to this presentation I made. So we've identified the errors, right, using the logs, and we're handling the errors. So we have different strategies like break, ignore, resume, rollback, and commit. Another couple things you may want to do is notify yourself. And also you may want to resume the work. So you're obviously going to want to turn it back on. So once, that's so funny. I went on like autopilot and I just started reading it. But obviously turn it back on when it's as soon as possible so that you can run it again, but notify yourself. So one last thing here that's super, super important is if we want to, we can stretch this out, right? And we can add modules here if it breaks. So let's say, for example, I want to send myself a Slack message. So I can just simply send a message. So let's just type in message here and create a message. And I could just be like, hey, I'm just going to send it to a person, right? So maybe it's like, hey, I want to do a private message. I want to send it to Jono. Oops. Okay, this isn't working for whatever reason. I chose the wrong one here, direct message, and we're just going to send it to myself. Okay, there we go. So I'd send it to myself and say, there's an error with this workflow, please solve. Okay, perfect. And then I'd save that. And now all of a sudden, not only will it handle the error, but I can have custom modules if that scenario was to encounter an error, right? And usually what that is notifying somebody on your team so that they can solve the problem to get this workflow back up and running so that you can get back to printing money and not focusing on errors that are going to drag you down. So thank you guys so much for watching this video on error handling in make.com. If you liked this content, please make sure to subscribe to this channel down below because I will be making content just like this pretty much on a daily basis. Make sure to hit the thumbs up button as well and also turn on notifications. And I will see you guys in the next one. But also don't forget, if you guys have future video ideas on concepts you want me to run through, please make sure to leave that in the comments down below too. Bye-bye, guys.